So thank you all for coming, and please welcome Alexandria Smith.
Hello, thank you for coming. I want to, since this is recorded, make sure I add a little bit of a correction in that I'm one of the co-organizers of Black Women Artists. We don't claim to have any founder because we all came together, all 50 plus of us came together to create what became a collective by accident. So just to clear that up. So I'm one of the co-organizers, but thank you all for coming. It got cold and it's wet outside, and I was here when it was warm and I got spoiled really quickly a few days ago. But I appreciate you coming out here, and I'm basically going to take you through the evolution of my work and how I've arrived at the work downstairs, and pretty much going back to around grad school, 2009, so about 10 years ago. I'm going to try to squeeze that into a 30-minute-ish talk or so. I think that's how much time I have. But the title, or part of the title of my talk, All the Women in Me, comes from a Nayyirah Waheed poem that simply states, all the women in me are tired. So we'll start there. Should we turn down the lights a little bit? Or? Okay. I like to start with an embarrassing photo to break the ice, but also because I guess in my opinion, this is kind of the first appearance of defiance in my life. And not only through the imagery, pigtails, the dresses, and matching barrettes, which you see sort of these motifs appear in my work, and they've always appeared in my work, but also is that I basically was declared that I was an artist at a very young age. I mean, here the evidence states that I was 6, so now you know my age also. But my mom she's always telling me, she texts me like, you said that you were 6, but you were actually 3 when you said you were an artist. And no one could, we don't know where you got that from, but there are no artists in my family, so I had to make sure for my mom that it started at 3, but this is the evidence that I do have. I'm an artiste. And this kind of defiance, I feel, is sort of evident throughout my work and representative of my subject matter and ethos. So when I was in grad school, this is some early work from graduate school that was heavily influenced by literature. Most of my work is, whether it's subconsciously or literally, intentionally. But during this particular time in my life, I was heavily inspired by The Bluest Eye, which was Toni Morrison's first novel. And what drew me and attracted me to that novel and inspired a series of paintings was this awkwardness of childhood. This moment where figures and the girls, I'll say girls for now because they do transcend gender later on, but the girls in my paintings were sort of trying to discover their sense of self and understand and get to know their bodies and understand their place in the world. And those same themes were prevalent in Toni Morrison's novel. I also was making paintings in which the subjects were ignoring or disregarding the viewer. And so there's more of you doing the looking, or they're being looked at or spied on. And they're engaging in play that borders on sexuality, sexual activity, or violent, semi-violent activity. But ultimately, I lost my train of thought. But they're ultimately implicating the viewer in their activities. So they're making you complicit in their actions, and it's I'm putting on, in some ways, the awareness of an act of looking and locating yourself in relationship to the subject you're looking at, putting on the mask of the stereotype, and shifting and tweaking the ability of a quick read. Or at least that was the goal in the paintings. But I hit a point post-grad school, so this was one of the last paintings I made in graduate school before I left and before I graduated from Parsons. I felt like I had hit a wall in my paintings. I was unhappy with the conversations that had been happening throughout grad school, and I didn't know where to go. I was, post-grad, I was in Brooklyn. I was a full-time art teacher and trying to figure out how to make my art happen and find time to make work. So I had a little alcove space in my living room because I couldn't afford to have a studio space, and something just compelled me to just take a look at all the work I had made up until that point. So I printed all these paintings that I had made over the years, hung them up. You know, I joke and say I borrowed the school copy machine and printer. Took advantage of those resources while I was teaching high school art and looked at everything on the wall. And something just compelled me to start cutting up those images and collaging them. And for me, these characters came about intuitively. I didn't create any sketches. There were no plans for them. I just started to cut the figures up, cut these images of the paintings up, and build these environments around these hybrid characters that I was creating. And so this is one of the first collages that I made, and you'll see this figure appear and reappear again in different ways throughout over the years. So making these collages, I mean, half the work was already done for me. I had all the images and symbology that I needed, and things were pared down to the bare essentials. So I was able to embrace sort of the intuitiveness of drawing, but through collage and drawing with scissors, as Matisse says. You know, collage allowed me to fragment space. I could change things around easily and as often as I needed to. And so achieving variety and complexity was very simple. So the girls had now become these hybrid figures, and I realized that I was starting to create the psychological version of the figure in bodily form. So they were really bizarre in nature. They had missing or multiple limbs, featureless faces, but they still had identifiable garments and attributes. So titles for my pieces happen after the work is completed. Usually, I consider myself a language hoarder, so I collect like phrases, words, sentences, quotes that I would overhear on the train or just in passing. And whatever grabs my attention is archived in my sketchbook or on my phone. And sometimes I revisit those lists, if I can find them, when I'm titling and looking for a title for a piece. So in these two examples of collages, you see some very familiar phrases. Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. That's an excerpt from that. So it was a song or a nursery rhyme. And then home is where the heart is where I've sort of extracted that title. And I liked for these titles to still be quite ambiguous. So they alluded to something, but it still didn't give you any clear answers. I kind of resist wall text, which you see downstairs, but even in my titles, they allude to something, but they're not giving you any clear answers because, to be honest, I don't really have the answers, even after making the work. So the collages were performative and more like crude stage sets, and it allowed me to sort of wrestle with painting and concepts in painting, but also engage my entire body in a unique way. So I'd been making collages for about 1.5 years at this point. I enjoyed them. They were easy to make, quick, fun, playful. But I missed painting and consider myself a painter, so I missed it. And I wanted to figure out how to bring these figures, these hybrid figures, back into the painting realm. And so I was compelled to just remake a collage as a painting. And so this collage, Go Run Tell That, became a diptych. And in this diptych painting was when I started to explore different materials. So this is more of a mixed media painting. It's hard to see that detail because it's pretty flattened, pretty much flat because of the digital, photo. But some of the areas that are built up is the fence in the background. It's built up so it's more dimensional, using an acrylic medium. The leaf-like motif behind the figure is gold leaf. There's some parts of the figure's dress that are also textured and built up. And then on the right side, I've used some pen and ink in the pigtail rendering. And then I learned at a residency how to transfer, to make a digital print on an acrylic skin. So it's basically an acrylic skin, cured acrylic medium that's thin enough to go through a printer and superimpose that image onto it. So that's how I started to experiment with making paintings that were slightly different than the collages, not just a replica, and still use texture to create depth. So again, the skins are still present in the breast. There's some droopiness in her breast that are created using acrylic polymer skin. But this is when black glitter appeared in the mouth, which is kind of hard to see, but I have a funny little anecdote about black glitter. When I taught middle school and high school art for nearly 10 years in the South Bronx and East Harlem in New York City, and I banned glitter in my classrooms. I maybe had one student that begged, and I'd say, you have to come up during lunch. No one else can be around. You have to make sure I don't see a spot of glitter anywhere. And she did a good job of that, but no one else could use glitter. It was locked up in my closet. I hated it because it ended up everywhere. And now it's come back to haunt me. But the reason I used black glitter, which I was resistant to, was because I wanted to create a greater sense of depth in the paintings. And I couldn't find a tube paint color that was dark enough, black enough, that absorbed enough light, that could do the same thing that glitter can do. Now there's something called Vanta Black, but we have Anish Kapoor to thank for patenting that and not allowing any other artist to use it. But I wanted something that felt unnerving and created a sense of dis-ease as you were looking at it, similar to black velvet. I also was thinking about the phrase black is beautiful from the 60s, which was a way of sort of reclaiming your blackness, your identity as beautiful, opposed to what was being said in the media. So then the glitter began to function both as a mask and also a symbol of pride. So the girl's face in this painting is completely covered in black glitter. And this painting is downstairs. So the more I started to paint these hybrid figures, the more they began to transcend age and gender. Sometimes I'm making pop cultural references in my work. I'm playing with humor, which this one in particular was inspired by a Seinfeld episode. There was it's politically problematic and incorrect, I recognize now, but it was an episode Seinfeld went out on a date with a woman with man hands, which is incredibly problematic. But when I saw that episode, I wasn't aware at the time of how problematic it was. I found humor in it. And so that inspired this painting, but I wanted to use that newfound knowledge that I had in this painting to push against what masculinity and femininity are, or how they're defined, and push more towards the concept of exploring fluidity of gender. So using humor in the absurd. So a lot of the references that aren't maybe as immediate in my paintings and my work, this one also is downstairs in the show, but they all reference in some way, a lot of them reference Western history painting, Renaissance, Baroque era paintings. And for me, I love like the peculiarity and strangeness of religious paintings. There was a lot of spirituality and power, as well as subservience embedded in them. And I wanted to create or use these art historical hints as a way of provoking the viewer to encouraging the viewer to have a deeper sort of engagement with the work. And so I placed these characters as central to the narrative as opposed to these accessories or these subsidiary elements, the way they are depicted, black women are depicted in the Western history paintings. So I continue to simplify the figure even more, embracing a collage aesthetic, using different materials, found wallpaper, contact paper, graphite powder, and digital prints, which was my way of sort of exploring materials to create a greater sense of depth and play with surfaces, which is, like John said, is happening in the paintings downstairs that you don't see on a screen. I dabbled in printmaking. I learned how to make monoprints and fell in love with this sort of way of immediately getting out an idea. It was very intuitive, the way that my earlier pen and ink drawings and collages were. But there's always this element of surprise because you never know what would come out once you rolled the plate and paper through the press. But it also captured more immediately my every mark and gesture of my hand. So most of my prints that I would make were ghost prints, and that is the second print that you make once the plate still has some ink on it. I didn't like the first prints or the first pulls as they're called, so I would work back into the plate and print it again, and then I could control what areas were more saturated versus which areas were more transparent. But then I used those first pulls or initial prints that I felt were failures as a way of building up a painting and with a more mixed media approach. So I would use those and collage them and create something new from just those first pulls. So I'm only showing a few of those, that series here, of these monoprint collage paintings, but I did a good handful of them and combined them with acrylic paint and graphite powder and mounted them to panels. So I'm always like hoarding all this material, hoarding language, hoarding material, and using it in some way, shape, or form. So I have an obsession with the Baroque period, and I began researching that period in depth. I really focused on the aesthetic and conceptual characteristics of the Baroque period, which were really complex and contradictory, for lack of a better word. But they all showed and depicted the relationship between the spiritual, the sensual, and the sexual, which I found really fascinating. And so those compositions inspired my next sort of body of work, which were these collage installations. I wanted to break the plane of the rectangle and the square and step outside of painting, or painting in air quotes, and I wanted to engulf the viewer in the work. So I started making these mixed media collages on paper that were mounted onto the wall directly, unframed. I love that we hear the Indigo Girls in the background. It's great. I didn't know they were still singing. So now I had another way of engaging my entire body. I was working on a sort of working between a micro and macro scale of working with my body, which is really important to me, and I think that speaks to my years as an athlete. I played soccer and basketball my whole life, and so I can't just do one thing. I have to sort of find ways to engage my whole body at some point, otherwise I get really bored. And that could be because I'm a Gemini also, I don't know. Maybe a little bit of both. But these collage installations allowed me to coalesce my two competing interests, like intimacy and playfulness, and collaging with the narrative painting. They're cheering for me, it's great. Yeah, see, I was thinking the same thing. I love it. So they just kept getting bigger and bigger, these collage installations, and bigger. And they started, at this point, when I made this painting, I was at a residency at the Fine Arts Work Center, and it's 2015, and I believe it was when the George Zimmerman not guilty verdict came down. So I'm on the tip of Cape Cod, very lonely, isolated place during the off season, and trying to wrestle with this injustice, essentially. And it just felt like every week another black person was killed at the hands of police. And so there were just hashtags galore. And I just was frustrated at not being able to do anything or not get involved with any of the protests because I was away at a residency. And so this is what came about. This is where I put all of my energy. I put all of the techniques I learned, silk screening, monoprinting, drawing, painting, all inspired by the big wave by Hokusai. Like, all that went into this collage. And then the work came even further off the wall into a more immersive experience where I incorporated projection. And there's that glitter again. That whole wall is like a black glitter wallpaper that I discovered that only a company in the UK makes. It's crazy. But creating more of an immersive experience, but still incorporating, sculpture, painting, collage into the work. And I love that this was unintentional, but the floors of the gallery were covered with resin. And I didn't know at the time that that's what the space that I was going to be inhabiting would look like, because it was a brand new, newly renovated space that this gallery, AIR Gallery, inhabited. And so it was a surprise don't recommend any gallery coat their floor with resin, but it worked really well for me because all the imagery on the walls were reflected in the floor. And so then this is like the last sort of body of work I made prior to the work that's downstairs. This is a show that I had at the Union for Contemporary Art in January of 2017, and it was named after a famous track, Trilo Tenderness by Otis Redding, in which he implores men to show greater caring towards women. But some people also believe that he was singing about women's class struggles and heteronormative values that equated to womanhood and ideals of beauty and male companionship. And I like that sort of interpretation of that song better because it really fell in line with the why I make the work that I make, what I'm pushing up against. And so I wanted to challenge our relationship to the space of the gallery and explore how women and girls' bodies can be used to subvert or resist implications of forced femininity and the male gaze. So this was my first time painting the gallery walls. I'd never done that before, but directly across from it was a collage installation, one of my largest ones to date. And so they had this really interesting conversation between the two. Especially because the walls were painted with the stripes. And I extracted elements from my paintings and into the gallery walls, painted them on the gallery walls. So again, I'm still using or creating the psychological version of the figure, but now the bodies are further fragmented. There is this sort of non-linear narrative created each time they're hung together on the wall. That changes every time. But I love that they worked as a cohesive element together, but also as individual paintings, they also had strength and power on their own. So all these paintings were really around a period of 2 years, 1.5 to 2 years, 2015 to 17, most of them being 2017. So then this collage, the Union for Contemporary Art, where I had the show, has a commission project called the Wanda D. Ewing Commission, and they commission a woman artist from the diaspora to create a new piece or a new body of work for a solo show. And so for this one, this being a 40-foot collage, I'd never made anything this big in my life. And I felt the effects of it for weeks. But I noticed that with Wanda D. Ewing, who is not as well known, but an incredibly prolific printmaker from Omaha. She taught at the University of Nebraska, Omaha for many years before she passed away from cancer. And so when they sent me all of her work, images of her work, I realized that we had so many similarities. We both were fragmenting women's bodies. We had an affinity for reimagining iconic paintings. And so I thought, why not combine her symbology and language with mine? And so I came up with this concept in this piece called The Pleasure Principle, in which I am exploring the concept of forced femininity and just wanting to convey feelings of self-empowerment, self-love, and freedom in the work. So the black figures are hers, the pink leg on the left side and the black leg or dark brown leg on the right are images from her work that I then combine with mine. And so it's canvas and paper. There are printmaking techniques used in this painting, from monoprinting, silkscreen, paint on canvas, a little bit of everything once again. Acrylic skins. And there were two specific artists that I was looking at, Paul Cézanne and his Large Bathers series, and Edward Manet and his painting Luncheon on the Grass. were the compositional inspiration for this work. This is just an installation shot of we're getting closer to the work that I'm making now, but an installation shot of the show that I had at Mass MoCA, the show that I was a part of at Mass MoCA. It's pretty cool to kind of have basically have my own room within a huge group exhibition. Such an honor, and really changed the way I see my work because there were paintings from different periods of my life in that show that covered maybe 4 or 5 years. And then my most recent body of work, which I call it the Duality series. And when I set out after having the show at the Union, I didn't know, what I was going to do. I kind of stuck looking at white panels on the wall in my studio and just trying to figure out what to do next. And so I returned to my comfort zone, which is drawing. And I knew that I wanted to create a body of work that basically, in my head, I said I wanted it to look like my collage installations and my paintings had a baby. And so I immediately went to scale. It seemed like scale was the right fit, that I just needed to go back to making really large paintings. And so when I started making these drawings, I had never made full color drawings before. Usually my drawings were black pen on craft paper or on white paper, or they were really rough thumbnail sketches as preliminary drawings for paintings. But these were the first full color, fully realized drawings that felt complete to me. And the color palette had completely shifted. I'm sure that had a lot to do with what was happening in the world, because these were all made in late 2017 into last year. So I won't recall what was happening at the time, but it was dark times we're still in. And so sometimes the drawings weren't intended to be paintings. Like I didn't make them like, oh, let me make some drawings because I'm going to then turn them into paintings. But it felt right that they become paintings. Not all of them, but some of them. And even though I was challenged with working with this darker color palette, a lot of purples and grays and blues, I felt like having the opportunity to experiment on paper, on a small scale with marker, really freed me up to be able to experiment on a larger canvas as well. And so I made a lot of all these paintings I made mostly last year in probably a 4-month period. And so these are some of the install shots from the first time they were shown at BU, Boston University, in January. And I wanted to, I had ambitious goals of creating a large-scale installation with sculptures, but I underestimated my time. But I started to explore and experiment with different surfaces by using different types of paint. So going with very matte black paint to high gloss paint, graphite, glazing, building up thicker areas using oil, crayon. All these different things that I was doing with printmaking were now translated into painting and just using pure paint. So I have something that I do want to read about this series that was written by Nicole Carruth in the essay for this show, that I think is just, she says it best and describes it best, that beneath the superficial human veneer is where we might see ourselves in others and find greater compassion. Smith's art is a mirror and a messenger, foretelling a dystopian or utopian future that rests in our ability to look deep within. I think that one sentence really describes perfectly what was going on internally as I was making these paintings and what I feel and hope is happening when people see the paintings. I'm creating moments of tension between the ideal and the real, fantasy and reality, that I feel creates a more nuanced abstraction. It complicates and simplifies the figures and the environments that they're inhabiting further. But then there's this mirror image, or potentially you're seeing either two figures or one figure. But it's a lot about the ego and the alter ego at play here. And try to lure you in so that you can intensely experience the physical and emotional aspects of the work. These paintings evoke the blue-gray light of twilight, and hopefully create a more contemplative approach to seeing. And this is, it's honestly really difficult for me to talk about the work because it is one of my more personal bodies of work that I've made. I feel more closely connected to this work than any other previous work. And so I'm still trying to work through it, analyze it, make sense of it, understand it, all at the same time when it's just brand new and kind of put out there, which is really difficult. But it is also about visibility and invisibility. These figures are merging into each other and into the spaces that they're a part of, that they're inhabiting in really interesting ways. So it also is about formal explorations of positive and negative space and color and light. And I want my work in these paintings to really invoke thought and not provide any single answer, because there really isn't one. This is when it's a great time for questions. Bail me out. Yes.
What does the purple signify, both in a racial or sexuality context?
I wouldn't say that it does signify anything in a racial or sexual context. I think that I love Prince. Mm-hmm. Start there. Got a Prince tattoo. That's actually a cop-out. No, that's part of it. But in all honesty, I think that I didn't want to make the figures racialized. So I thought, purple is both blue and red. It's a cool color, but it also represents royalty in a lot of cultures. And it has the ability to make things sort of racially ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So that's the best answer I can give you, because I wouldn't say they are about a race or any sort of sexual, anything sexual in particular. But I wanted to resist an easy read of racializing the work. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, I am a Black woman and I can't hide that, nor do I want to. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the conversations that I was having, or that were being had around my work earlier, was that there was this projection of myself and my own experience onto the work because I was depicting the brown body. Mm-hmm. So I thought of how could I complicate that even further and use other colors so that it creates some distance and maybe other people can see and relate to what they're looking at and not just focus on the maker. When have you ever seen purple paintings, though? It's not a color that's used often in contemporary art, either.
So I envy you, because I don't use purple too much in my work.
Anyone else have a question? I like to end with this quote by Mother Toni Morrison, who's incredible. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair. No place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write or paint, right? We do language, that is how civilizations heal. I believe in that wholeheartedly.
One question.
Thank you.
There's a lot of verticals going on. There have been in installations where you have a painting downstairs in the gray.
Yeah.
There's all these verticals happening, and you talk so much about everything and all about them. I'm curious about those. Where are those verticals?
The vertical
The
stripes?
stripes. What is that
Well,
signify?
initially it was all types of wallpaper, but I thought about how I didn't want to paint intricate wallpaper in my work, first and foremost, but I thought, what is the simplest sort of wallpaper that alludes to both interior and exterior spaces? And stripes, they could be stripes, they could be bars, they could be railings, they could be a fence, they could be keeping something out or something in. They're still very ambiguous motif, and that's why I think I've gravitated towards stripes. But they also create this sense of, this sort of unnerving sense of space. If you stare at some of the stripes downstairs, especially in the painting with the two black figures, things start to move and vibrate and shift.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like what Albers talks about in his color theory concepts. It's a way of altering your sense of space in relationship to the paintings because there's optical illusion that's happening. Yeah, it's altering your perception, definitely. Any other questions? Yes.
I thought I saw some elements of nature.
Mhm.
There was one piece that you had, it looked like the figures were coming out of the limbs of a tree.
Of this most recent body of work?
It was, well, maybe that was my interpretation. It looked like, because it looked like a tree, limbs of a tree.
Mhm.
You had the bodies in there, and I didn't notice the name of the work, but that wasn't what you were drawing.
Well, I mean, it's great that you mentioned the tree element because there's a grass motif on the gallery walls from this painting. And that was also, again, pushing against whether you're looking inside out or outside looking in, if you're in an interior space or an exterior space, and trying to complicate the narrative in that way by incorporating this leaf motif,
Is that
grass
the same
motif.
thing you were doing with the flower?
Same thing I'm doing with the flower and the trees and other elements in the paintings, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes, I can't see you. Hi.
I'm interested in the cleft cup shape I see on a lot of your knees.
Oh.
What do you mean by that?
I was wondering when someone's going to ask that question. That always comes up. So the kneecaps. So I have two answers. I have the easy answer, and then I have what inspired them answer. Do you want one or both?
Both.
Well, I'll give the simple answer first, is that they operate as both a form of protection. They are pads and they are knees simultaneously. So there's that. That's one answer. But the other answer is that when I was a kid, I would see patterns in like floorboards and different walls and clouds, like most young people do. But in my knees, I thought that I had like mouth knees. So they kind of looked like mouths, and I would like curl them so they could talk. And so that was like the initial inspiration. So I started making these knees that look like mouths, and some people say they look like closed eyes. That's where the personal inspiration comes in. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think it's maybe the one after this, but there's one where they finally, this one they have the gloves. The one where they finally get to high five, they have like hands. Why do they get hands in that picture?
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Do they not have hands in other ones? Oh, I guess they don't. Huh. Good observation. It's a great question.
That's a good answer too.
Yeah. And I'm looking at them on the bottom of the thumbnails. They're only, that's the only one. That one and this one are the only ones that have hands.
See, I thought those were tree limbs.
Oh, that's what you're referring to. So it's interesting so these figures, they seem like they're missing limbs, but in some instances they're also whole. They exist as whole in the world that they live in. But to us, in our world, they feel like they're fragmented. But they aren't always fragmented. Sometimes we're not seeing the limbs that are quote unquote missing because they don't have them or because they're hidden. Yeah.
This is a good one. The meaning behind the titles. This is called Skin.
Folk.
and the other one was incognegros.
Yes.
What do the names mean in relationship to the pieces?
The names, for this one, like I said earlier, was about the idea of the simultaneous absence and presence of the bodies, the visibility and invisibility. And the term incognegros refers to incognito,
Right.
but then also incognegros. It was, I don't know where the term came from, but I was playing with words a little bit and combining words to allude to sort of what's happening, kind of what's obviously happening in the paintings, that they're disappearing or reappearing.
And the same thing with skin.
Skinfolk, another play on words, because it's kinfolk, skinfolk. There's a phrase that says, in the black community in particular, like not all skinfolk are kinfolk.
Right.
So there's a little bit of that at play in the title here. Yes?
In one of your first paintings you showed, there's a picture of a bird cage,
Mm-hmm.
and it's open. Was there anything in particular that you meant for that to symbolize?
So I can sometimes, and I can't give direct answers to all the symbols that are present in the work. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I can say, oh, this means that, but oftentimes that's not the case, because it is about how you're seeing the whole picture and how you're interpreting the whole picture. But so I really try not to pick apart the paintings and say this means that, because sometimes what you're bringing and what you're seeing is also part of the interpretation of the work too. And that's really important to me, that there is an engagement, because I don't always have, like, there's no black or white, right or wrong answer in my work. There's a lot of analysis that happens over time for me as well. And I want the same for those of you looking at the work. At least I hope for that.
That one makes me think too about that. I can't remember the name of the song exactly, but it's something like your phone's off the hook, but you're not.
Yes, in the back.
Yes, you mentioned about how women's bodies are perceived, perception, definition, self-definition. But I noticed with the eyes stick out so much. They're very striking. Are the eyes meant to be perceiving each other, perceiving, themselves, or are they saying, we see you looking at us?
It's a little bit of,
you're looking at us.
it's D, it's all the above. And it depends, it changes. I'm not trying to be evasive at all, I'm being very honest.
If I stare at it long enough, I can swear that one of the eyes start moving, so I'm like, wait, are they going to we're looking at them right now? So.
Yeah, it is a lot about the gaze. Who holds the power in the gaze?
Right, exactly.
Is it you, is it them, or is it everyone?
Right.
Yeah.
I think this piggybacks on the last question, but when it comes to portraying narratives about, especially about race and gender, what do you think is the importance of personal experience from the artist?
I think that it's impossible to not create work that doesn't involve or incorporate your personal experience. But I do think that there is a little bit more, or a lot more emphasis on personal experience when it comes to artists of color. I think the questions that artists of color are asked speak more to their autobiographical experience and more often than not. And so I don't think it's possible to make work. I believe it's all autobiographical in some way. But in my work in particular, and I'm not setting out to make work about my life. This isn't about my life. This is about the ways that I see the world, and that I try to share how I see the world with others, I guess. Yeah. Last chance to ask questions. I'm not answering any downstairs. I'm just kidding. Hello. Yes, I'm behind you. No, you. Yeah.
Okay, I would just like to contribute that kind of the way that the eye, as it's the only facial feature, and then what you said about what the viewer sort of interprets their own definition, and the way that this eye is the experience is sort of an autonomous play with
Mhm.
what you're presenting and what one is experiencing, the visual versus who can say which means to the mouth. So the mouth sort of becomes the eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an idea.
Wow. Thank you. Yes.
Do you, in your mind, you had mentioned that you work mostly like intuitively.
Mhm.
Do you have a sense of the whole picture at all, or do you start with a central thing? Like, are you additively kind of challenging and supporting your image while you're making it, or do you have a notion of like this one?
I don't when I'm drawing. I have no idea what's going to happen when I'm drawing. Sometimes I get an image, like the show that I currently have that's being installed at the Queen's Museum. I had a dream about that show, like about what it looked like. Not every single element, but some elements. And sometimes I do, images just pop up, and so then I'm trying to record and document what I saw, the image I saw in my head. Other times when I'm just sketching freehand, I don't know what's going to happen. But the paintings are inspired by, or the sketches are plans for the paintings. So I always, when I start painting, have an idea of what's coming, what's happening. My intuitiveness happens more so in my drawings, and then I play with color, with paint, but the composition is planned. Play with color and surfaces and all that when it comes to painting. Yeah, sometimes I make sketches and I'm like, this is a weird drawing. Like, I don't know where this came from, but it's there it is, you know. Yeah.
You were mentioning earlier about one of the paintings at Negro.
Mm-hmm.
Coincidentally, there's a graphic novel that was released in the last decade, Matt Johnson, that dealt with that issue with trying to assimilate it to the white supremacy in the plans. And also, there was a novel earlier in the 20th century by Walter White, who headed the NAACP, who wrote a novel along the lines of Matt Johnson.
Have to check it out. Thank you.
And also, I noticed there's a theme with the feet, almost a sense of aggression or authoritarianism.
With the feet?
Yeah.
That's the first interpretation I've heard. That's interesting. Thank you. Do we get to hear the Indigo Girls in the gallery too? Yeah? Oh, wonderful. Totally joking. Thank you all for coming. So let's head downstairs.